thank you to everyone for coming tonight. I am going to go ahead and just get started. I'm going to go ahead and have my co-hosts post the link to the handout in the Zoom chat. They're going to post that a few times as people trickle in or trickle out. And so if you see anyone ask for it, I'll just throw the link in there. So whoever can do that would be great. I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. This is quite a large class, so we're going to do our best to have everyone get a chance to ask whatever questions they want. We are going to go ahead and ask that everyone stay muted unless you're asking a question. We'll call on you. You can put your questions into the Facebook chat or the Zoom chat. I've got my co-hosts watching that, so that should be good. And then if you want to speak, if you want to ask the question out loud, use the raise hand feature in Zoom. Please don't actually raise your hand because I can't see everyone right now. And that would be really sad. And I don't want you to be flailing and be unseen, and that's just not good. So please do use the raise hand feature in Zoom. If you don't know how to do that, put that into the Zoom chat and one of my co-hosts will explain it to you. So for everyone who doesn't know, my name is Zahra. I live in the Middle Kingdom and I am the SCA Corporate Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. This class is identifying and addressing cultural appropriation. And it's actually the very first class that I ever taught in the SCA a couple of years back. So I want to be very upfront. We are going to be using some potentially ever-evolving terms about a very sensitive subject here. And I know that it might be upsetting or disturbing for some people. I know that some of this may be unfamiliar, some of it may be familiar. I really want to challenge everyone here to keep an open mind throughout our discussion. Please be respectful of the multiple viewpoints that are going to be expressed here. If you reach a point where you feel too uncomfortable to participate in the conversation, please don't feel obligated to stay. I know that some of these topics can be very difficult and very uncomfortable. So if you need to step out for your own mental health, 100% fine. There's no problem whatsoever. I won't be mad. I want you to take care of you. So the way this class is designed is for the first 20 or so minutes, I'm going to cover what cultural appropriation is to give us the same working definition. I'll talk a little about what makes cultural appropriation different than cultural exchange, appreciation, or assimilation. And then what makes appropriation so damaging, particularly to minority communities? We're just going over the basics. Think of this as a 101 to familiarize yourself with all the terms. Make sure that we're all talking from the same standpoint, using the same words in the same way. This topic is much bigger than this one class. It's much bigger than even a track of classes. So we really just want to get down the basics and make sure that we are all talking about it in the same way. And a lot of people don't really understand what it is and they're concerned because the SCA is such a unique space for us to really discuss this in. So we will be couching this in a modern perspective because yes, we're all here playing the same game, but we're inescapably products of modern society. So I do want us to reach shared understanding on that level. After that, we'll open things up for discussion and we'll move into the SCA perspective. And you can ask anything. No questions are too basic. If you're wondering about something or unclear about a concept, someone else probably is too. So this is the place for us all to talk it out. Like I said earlier, I've got helpers who will watch chats for me. Questions can go in the Zoom chat, the Facebook chat, or use the raise hand feature in Zoom. Please do aim for no more than a minute when you're asking the question, just because it does look like we have a pretty large number of people tonight. And I want to make sure that we're moving along well. Please don't be offended if we cut you off to move on, because I'm happy to have follow-up discussion via email or even plan another discussion session. I just want to make sure that we get to as many folks as possible tonight. So after we've clarified any basics for the cultural appropriation definition and understanding, we'll talk about strategies for self-reflection and avoiding it in our own personas. I want this society to feel comfortable exploring other cultures and learning about other cultures. And we want people to feel comfortable pursuing whatever persona that they're interested in a way that is productive and not at all harmful. So that sometimes looks like different things, but it's still a good thing. I can't emphasize that enough. We do want the SCA to be a place where we can continue to learn collectively. And we're going to develop those strategies together. There's no singular right answer. Avoiding appropriation may look a little different depending on what the culture is. So we will talk through all of that. Finally, I want to talk about goals. You'll see a general goal on the handout, but I want to tell you my personal goal and purpose here. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I can't tell you what to do. This is an opportunity to learn and understand a new perspective. And it's really going to come down to personal choice and being self-critical. So I want everyone to have the tools to engage with this discussion if they so choose. So let's go ahead and get started. There's a very general definition of cultural appropriation that floats around, and I think it confuses a lot of folks. And that definition is when somebody adopts aspects of a culture that's not their own. Now, as you can see, that is incredibly broad and generic, and it becomes even harder to pin down when you live in a country that fundamentally prides itself on being a mixture of cultures like the US, or you play in a historical society like ours that explores those cultures and many besides, right? It creates a question, and that question is, what does it mean to adopt aspects of a culture? Like, if I make tacos for dinner, am I appropriating? What if I wear a Celtic cross? Or what if I write a haiku? Or what if I buy a poncho, right? It's broad, it's vague, and it sucks. It's a bad definition. It's so non-specific and it's so messy that it applies to the vast majority of the population at any given time. And that's bad because it makes it easy to downplay and dismiss. If everyone is appropriating all of the time, then it can't be that bad, right? Then nobody's appropriating. So we're not using that definition. We are going to get a lot more nuanced. So when we talk about problematic cultural appropriation, what we mean is actually closer to misappropriation, and that's related to power dynamics. So you can see on your handout, it's when members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who have been systematically oppressed by that dominant group for profit, whether social or financial, or to the detriment of the second culture. And breath, because I know that that's a lot, and we're totally gonna get into that. So let's unpack it. When we say the term dominant culture, that can shift depending on where in the world you are, but mostly you should be looking at historical context in addition to actual geographic location. I might use majority or dominant interchangeably, but I'm generally never referring to numbers. I'm referring to power structures. When I say elements, elements can be as direct as clothing or as indirect as inspired fashion or hairstyles. This isn't a hard and fast rule. What makes something appropriation is rarely this bolded, clear line, but instead it's this little thin gray line that loops and is sometimes really hard to spot at all. There are a lot of opportunities to explore and learn about other cultures, even as a member of a dominant culture, and none of them are appropriative. You may already be engaging in some of those ways yourself in the SCA. So let's talk about things that are not cultural appropriation. And I want to start with exchange. Cultural exchange can occur when a participant is invited into a culture and then humbly and respectfully participates within a given framework. So let's take, for example, a wedding in which an American groom is marrying an Ethiopian bride. The ceremony can begin with the participants dressed in maybe traditional Western wedding clothes, but midway through they step out and they change into fairly traditional Ethiopian garments. Maybe they say a short piece about the significance of their outfit to their guests during or after the ceremony. At no point in this scenario are the cultures represented being mocked. It's not problematic. Both the bride and the groom have invited the other to participate in their respective culture in this way, and they're mindful of the significance of that invitation. The audience has also been invited into the ceremony to participate. So this is not what we think of as appropriation. Closely related, sometimes interchangeably, is the term cultural appreciation. Appreciation doesn't always involve taking elements of another culture for your own. It may just be limited to study and research. So let's say that you're a graduate student and you're pursuing your master's in Geisha era Japanese literature, right? So you read and write 50 pages on Akutagawa's In a Grove, and you explore his use of unreliable narration compared to Dostoevsky, and you talk about the influence of Poe, and you drop a bunch of more literary terms. I don't know. You do that. At no point do you ever separate the work that you are studying and the inspiration that you are taking from the research that you are producing, right? It is intrinsically linked. You're completely transparent that you are studying something and you are learning from it. Your arguments are based on existent works that you always cite, and your thoughts reference your inspirations. So the link between you and the culture that you're exploring is apparent and undeniable. So I personally find that the common thread here is respect. A respectful, honest engagement with another culture, no matter your personal position, is a necessity for a non-appropriative effort. So let's look at cultural assimilation. And that is quite a different thing than cultural appreciation or exchange. Assimilation has a lot to do with who is doing it and why they're doing it. Assimilation refers to minorities taking on or giving up cultural characteristics out of survival or just life necessity. We all live in a society that subjectively values certain traits differently than others. Now, sometimes those traits are things that are integral to a culture, like food or fashion. And in some sad cases, this value hierarchy means that cultural groups are all but forced to abandon elements of their culture. I'm going to read you a couple of short excerpts from pieces by Asian American authors describing their experiences around cultural food as children. So author Ruth Tam writes in the Washington Post, "My childhood home in suburban Chicago always smelled like whatever we were cooking. Visiting us meant cloaking yourself in the scent of hamdan juyokbang, a dish of steamed pork and salted egg, or the perfume of mapodufu, tofu and minced pork with a spicy chili and fermented black bean sauce. I didn't mind the smells growing up because I wasn't aware of them. That is, until a high school friend declared my house smelled of Chinese grossness. The comment clung to me like the smell in my home. My hunger for my family's food was overpowered by my desire to fit in. So I minimized Chinese food's role in my life and learned to make pasta instead." Ming Chi, a Korean chef and YouTube star living in New York City, also writes of a similar experience in her life. So she writes, "I remember boiling my Korean soup soy sauce when I lived in Missouri, and my apartment manager knocked on my door. 'What's that smell? I got a complaint from your neighbor.' I was so embarrassed that I didn't make soup soy sauce again for a long time, even after I moved back to Korea." So in both of these cases, embarrassment and shame caused these women to let go of an element of their culture that they loved. And this is far from a unique experience. You see this again and again in the stories of members of a non-dominant cultural group in pop culture everywhere. There's an episode of Fresh Off the Boat where there's a young boy in the family who relays a story where his classmate calls his noodle lunch worms, and he demands of his parents that they pack a white people lunch for him instead. And it's not just food. Piercings and tattoos, often used to signify status or growth in other cultures, may hinder a job hunt in some societies. Religious coverings may create suspicion or draw unwanted attention. I spent years straightening my hair before every job interview because I had gotten multiple comments about it not being tidy or neat enough, about my natural hair, which is not this. It's much curlier and much bigger. It is straightened right now. But I got told it was inherently unprofessional in its natural state. That's a hard thing to swallow. And so when it comes down to, do I want to make a point or do I want to be employed? I usually chose the latter. That is cultural assimilation. You may see arguments similar to this of Black people imitating white hairstyles or something like that as reverse appropriation. But when quote unquote white hairstyles are what is considered socially acceptable, it's less of a preference and it's more of a necessity. Marginalized groups don't often have the luxury of ignoring subjective preferences set by the dominant culture. And this is where I really want us to start looking at that profit or detriment portion of our working definition. I'm going to remind everyone really quickly, the working definition is cultural appropriation is when members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who have been systematically oppressed by that dominant group for profit, whether social or financial, or to the detriment of the second culture. So, the latter half of that definition, let's explore a few reasons why cultural appropriation can be so harmful. Appropriation encourages people to take bites of a culture without ever needing to engage with the meal, right? A taste of something doesn't make you an expert. You'll find folks knowing what a dream catcher is and suddenly beginning to appropriate Indigenous culture in other ways without ever studying or acknowledging the specificity of the culture that they're looking at, which Indigenous group it is, the hardships and oppression that many have faced and still do face globally. Cultural appropriation allows people to effectively ignore any historical oppression. If I rewrite the story about a culture, I've created a false narrative and I'm perpetuating harmful stereotypes. So, for example, the Disney movie Pocahontas is wildly inaccurate. And the historical Pocahontas was paraded around as a civilized savage and died barely out of her teens in a completely different country. But the myth tends to be what people know. And lest we blame Disney, that myth predated the movie. So this was a problem before it was a show tune. Memoirs of a Geisha is another example of media that has defined people's understanding of a culture at a specific part of time. The book is a work of fiction written by Arthur Golden, who is a white man born in Tennessee. He claims to have sourced some of the material for his book from interviews with different geisha, including a woman named Mineko Iwasaki, but she and others have vocally objected to the way the book and later the film represented their culture. They felt that the story of their lives and profession had been twisted and exoticized to sell the story better. And the Hollywoodization of things can do that. You are trying to tell a story, you are trying to gather interest. And so things get sensationalized and exaggerated, and they may not represent original source material at all by the end of it. We're divorcing the source material from originators, and that means people don't necessarily have any idea where these things came from, so they couldn't give credit even if they wanted to. Rock and roll, yoga, even quinoa, Most people don't realize that the source of all these items originated with different people of color. And indeed, minority cultures lose the opportunity to benefit from their creations and their resources. And that's because cultural appropriation makes it permissible for the dominant group to practice and benefit from an element of a marginalized culture that they might not be able to claim for themselves. So let's think back to the author that I referenced earlier, Ruth Tam. She goes on to talk about the way Cantonese foods appeared later in her life. So I'm going to read another short excerpt. Little did I know that Americans would come to embrace the dishes and cooking styles that once mortified me. The Cantonese foods of my childhood have reappeared in trendy restaurants that fill their menus with perfectly plated, fine dining versions of our traditional cuisine. In some cases, this shift has been heartening, but in too many others, the trend has reduced staples of our culture to fleeting fetishes. And it's more than just food. The perm craze of the 80s mimicked the height and texture of African hair without ever really acknowledging that similarity. And in the modern day, we have fashion designers and models wearing cornrows and locks and being admired as high fashion, whereas some members of the Black community would be judged in certain environments for having them, despite them being ideal hairstyles for their hair texture. I know that all of this is a lot. I know it's a lot to take in, and there's a lot to kind of go over here. These are just a few of the many ways that cultural appropriation can be so harmful and so pervasive. So thinking critically together can help us identify appropriation and remedy it where we can. So at this point, we've established a working definition. We've identified the differences between appropriation, exchange, appreciation, and assimilation, and we know why it's harmful. So I want to open things up. I know people have been having questions, and if people are sitting on questions, please do drop them into chat here or on Facebook, and I have co-hosts that will help me get everything organized. I'm happy to talk first about if anyone had any questions about something I'd said, if they're unclear on any of the definitions, if they want to go over anything, and then we'll circle back around and we'll talk more broadly about the topic in the context of the SCA. So I want to start there, and I'm going to let my co-hosts kind of gather, and then we'll go from there. So please do raise your hand, and we will figure out who to start with in the list. Okay. So let's go ahead. So hands, I will check. Oh, we do have 100 people. Okay. I will scroll all the way up. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the first question in chat, and then I'll go to the first hand, and we'll just go back and forth. We'll do it that way. So the first question in chat, exoticization, could talk about that some more. Okay. So can we, I want to parse that out a little bit. Can you tell me more about what you want to know about exoticization? For me, it manifests usually as a culture that has an aspect about it that is interesting, and then people tend to focus on that aspect potentially to the point of hyperbole in order to make it better for media consumption. So this can mean cherry picking aspects of cultures. It can mean missing significant aspects of cultures that should not be missed, like religious symbols or cultural touchstones that you don't want to lose. But if you want to elaborate on what part of that you want to talk about more, I'm definitely happy to do it. You can drop that in the chat, and then we'll circle back around to exoticization. And then I have the Royal Majesties raise their hand. I don't know what kingdom you're from, but go ahead and unmute and you can ask your question.
This would be the king of the Middle Kingdom.
Hi, Majesty.
Hey, first of all, I wanted to say thanks for having a class. I'm just going to say thank you for everyone that you unmute. They don't have to thank you. I'm thanking them for all, so you can speed this along. So here's where I'm going to just ask a question, because here's what always, I always struggle with this part, because I've heard this before. Earlier, you mentioned, if I have tacos, am I misappropriating a culture? And then you cited Cantonese food. I love Cantonese food, so I just go to eat Cantonese food because I like Cantonese food. There's nothing, it's nothing more than that. So could you kind of explain that a little bit for people? Because I think people get caught up in it, and you know what I'm saying, we lose the audience sometimes, and they go, well, it's just food is just food, and that comes from a very, and I think that's the point you're trying to make, and so I would just like you to talk about it a little bit more.
Sure. Great question. So food is a really complex one, because especially in the US, we do have such a variety of different cultural foods, but many of them get sanitized for a more American palate. So think Tex-Mex versus what you would get if you went to Mexico, or Panda Express versus what you would get in a traditional Cantonese restaurant. So when the author talked about her childhood, she was being mocked for the type of food that were traditional, like legitimate Cantonese foods, which was very hurtful because they were outside of what her American classmates considered to be normal, right? Different types of meat, different cooking styles, even different smells, different things that you're not used to. But then as an adult, she started to see the same foods that had basically gotten her mocked her whole life suddenly be presented by white American chefs, but in this very sanitized fine dining way, where it wasn't quite her food, but suddenly people were profiting off of a shadow of it. And what had gotten her mocked for so long was now being elevated and being called amazing because it was coming from a different place. That's what makes it problematic, right? So when you eat tacos at home, it's unlikely that anything you're eating at home is going to be, something that you're going to profit off of, except in taste buds. And it's unlikely that you started the day by mocking someone else for their traditional tacos. In the case of this larger systemic issue, it really is an ongoing problem that we see a lot. And because it lends itself better to an American audience, sometimes, example, Cantonese restaurants actually trying to sell and profit off of their own food and culture wouldn't do as well as, your Panda Express, your more accessible, watered down version. So that's where you're kind of seeing a little bit more of the discussion that Ruth Tam wanted to flesh out as far as food goes. Is that clear? Does that help explain it a little bit more?
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted you to talk about it a little more because people don't think of it this way. They're just saying it's just tacos. And again, it's just like anything. It's how it's framed and how it's used. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, you're right. It's looking at it in the larger scope that can be potentially problematic, I think.
Hey, if I may, I usually use Microsoft Teams. I don't know how to raise my hand. I'm looking all over Zoom trying to find this. I'm not trying to cut somebody off. You can tell me to mute back and call back on me, or you can take me now. Either way.
So you can drop your question in chat,
okay.
Or you can just put raise hand.
Well, it's longer and it's more, like I said, it's more of a discussion. So I think being verbal or audio is a lot easier than trying to put it all in chat.
Okay, just drop your name in chat, and I will have my co-hosts add you to the list of people. and then we'll just call you out when we get there. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't know if we've gotten clarification on exoticization. I'm gonna stumble over that word several more times. So I'm gonna give them a sec to catch up with that and see if Tim was able to weigh in more with what he wanted to see on that, because it's a very busy chat. So in the meantime, I'm gonna go ahead. Alaric, can cultural appropriation happen between non-dominant cultures, not just dominant to non-dominant? So if you want to add anything else to that, please do feel free to unmute and jump in. I would say that when we talk about cultural appropriation in the more problematic definition, it's very hard for non-dominant cultures in terms of power differentials to really establish any kind of consequence for other cultures, because once they do have some sort of power differential, they become a dominant culture. Now, certainly non-dominant cultures can uphold appropriation that is happening in the same way that non-dominant groups can still perpetuate racism that is happening in larger power structures. So certainly you could see members of one non-dominant culture continuing to participate in the ongoing appropriation of some kind of anything, basically, of another non-dominant culture, but it would still be in the wider context of how that power structure is devaluing the item in specific. So I guess to kind of go to that, if we were looking back at the food conversation, right? So we're talking about the dominant power structure having a way of watering down cuisine in order to profit off of that themselves without necessarily giving credit to the group that formed it, whether financial or social. Certainly other groups could continue to demean that group and also try to profit off of it. But without that power structure in place, they would probably be unsuccessful. Does that make sense? That they can participate in the ongoing power structure and they can uphold it or perpetuate it, but they might not be able to create it? Because I think that's probably the gist of how I feel about that. And I will give folks time to gather thoughts. And if people want to respond, please do note that you want to respond and we can pull you from the chat, and that's fine. But I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna jump forward. Maggie asked, what is an example you have seen in the SCA of someone who went over the line past appreciation and into appropriation? So I have not personally seen anything that I would consider egregious. I have heard of things that I have found egregious. So when we talk about certain aspects of taking on culture, there are some hard lines that I think should be avoided at all costs. And one of those hard lines is imitating skin tone. So blackface or yellow face, if you are trying to imitate Asian skin tones. This is always bad. Always, always, always bad. Never, ever, ever do blackface. Never do it. There's never a good reason. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. If you take nothing else away from me tonight, please take that and just know that it's not okay. It will always be problematic. Someone will always call you out. You will hurt someone if you do this. So I have heard that in the SCA of many, many years past, people had tried to appropriate skin tone for themselves in putting on their persona, whether through yellow face. And I don't mean like white powdered makeup to make you look pale. I mean literally trying to appropriate the skin tone of someone else. And that would be way over the line. I would not recommend that you do that at all. that would be very bad. I have seen much more minor things, like, for example, kente cloth in African culture is, some African cultures, I should say, Ghanaian culture, more specifically, some Yoruba, tremendously, tremendously important and valued, and only really worn by royals in our time period. So that's more of kind of a misstep than I would say outright appropriation. But it could be problematic if the wrong person were to see it and go, I don't know if you're supposed to be using this in this way. So people really need to be cautious when we approach things that are culturally symbolic and important, or religious symbols are another downfall. Using religious symbols incorrectly can be really harmful, really damaging to the existing culture. So I think those are the largest missteps. Can you give an example of exoticization? So aside from what we've kind of already talked about with, actually, no, I can talk more about Memoirs of a Geisha here. So Memoirs of a Geisha, the film itself, has several concepts that are not necessarily accurate. So we've seen her auctioning off her virginity in one part in the book, and I believe it's alluded to in the movie. This is not necessarily something that happened. This was something that the author thought sounded good, and so put in to better sell the story and better create some kind of salaciousness around the idea of a geisha. But it is not something that is necessarily accurate. Many of the geisha who were interviewed for the book objected to this pretty strenuously, but were overruled. Another example of exoticization, if you look at the cherry picking that people will do with cultures, where they'll find one aspect of a culture that they find tremendously fascinating, they'll hyper focus on it. So let's go with the concept of headdresses for some indigenous cultures. So the idea of the headdress and the wise medicine man, or the you've got the wise Black character who can deliver. All of these things are ways to separate yourself from this other culture. You've picked a stereotype, you're going to lean hard into it. And that's what you're defining the culture with. You are making them other, and you are separating themselves with, you're separating yourself from them using whatever this particular stereotype is. So I would say that those are examples of exoticization off the top of my head. There's probably better ones. If anyone has anything that they want to throw out, sorry, I happened to catch the chat. Sugar skulls, I think, could be an aspect of grabbing one thing, applying it across the board without really understanding the symbology that goes behind it. Problematic. So I think if other people want to throw examples into chat, they should, but those would all be good examples for distancing yourself, taking a culture, and then flattening it to this one-dimensional read. Okay, Vargas, you have a question. Hey.
It's more of a statement than a question. In regards to having to straighten your hair for your job interview, I would consider that more of a discrimination than assimilation. Appropriate. Does that make sense?
So,
because I understand that you're trying to assimilate into the collective, but I guess I'm saying it from the aggressor's point of view, where they're discriminating against your natural hairstyle.
Right. So it's discrimination on the part of the aggressor. It's assimilation when I do it. So rather than, some people would contextualize my straightening my hair as, well, aren't you appropriating someone else's culture because you're making your hair into something that it's not? You're trying to make your hair look like other cultures' hair. But what it actually is, rather than anything appropriative, is assimilation on my part, because I need to fit in in order to not have that aspect be part of what I would potentially be discriminated against for. So I guess it's the perspective. So the subject is engaging in assimilation and the aggressor is engaging in discrimination.
It's interesting. I could talk more about this later, but it's too long for this. Because
I mean,
it sounds.
Can I comment on that?
Very briefly.
Sure.
Well, let me quickly say, it sounds like you're giving more power to the aggressors than to yourself.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's just my thinking on that.
Yes. So in this case, the people perpetuating the discrimination are the interviewers, the hiring manager, whoever I feel I need to do this for, because I had gotten negative comments from them. And so in terms of power structure, they do have the power, right? If I walk in and I say, you're going to give me this job, nothing happens. Maybe. If they walk in and they say, we're going to give you this job, hey, I now have a job. So in this case, there is a power structure and it is not in my favor. So I think giving them power would be a misnomer. I think it would be recognizing the power that they have in this circumstance. And not always, right? You're not always going to find people like that, but you don't know. And if you wait until you are there, sitting in an interview, watching someone side-eye your hair, it might be too late. And it's happened enough, with enough frequency and consistency, that, again, for many years, it was just easier to fit into the norm to begin with and not have to worry about that potentially being the reason why I didn't get a job that, quite frankly, I probably desperately needed, right? We're talking about when I was just out of college, just past, the recession. I mean, I needed what I could get. So the power structures already existed, I would say.
May I comment on that?
Sure.
A little bit of background. I went into the military when I was 17 years old. I've literally been around the world and seen most of the cultures. I haven't been to South America. I've been to Panama and Central America. I've been to the North Pole. I haven't been to Antarctica. I've literally been everywhere else. So we like to scream discrimination a lot. I don't think it was discrimination against you, honestly. When I worked with the Taliban and Afghans and Iraqis and stuff like that, their culture, if I'm clean shaven, they would not respect me. So I had to assimilate. That's not discrimination. It's just, for them, a man, you wore a beard. And in the military, we're not allowed to. So we wore a beard. You also don't show the bottom of your feet. That's highly offensive and stuff like that. In Europe, so you don't go out, like in America, wearing sweatpants, hoodies, and things like that. That's just not part of their culture. You dress up. Men wear slacks and button-down shirts. Women dress up and got the scarves around them and everything else and stuff. If you would go out in sweats, or if you would go to a job interview in sweats and a hoodie, they'd laugh you out of the building and stuff. So I don't think it's discrimination. It's part of a culture, and there's an expectation and a standard.
No, excuse me. We're talking about somebody's hair being styled naturally versus not. So that is discrimination. If you're telling someone that they can't wear their hair the way they were born to wear it, that's discrimination. We're not talking about her going in an interview in sweats and a t-shirt. I'm sorry, I'll stop.
Okay, and we're going to give the floor back to Jessica right now.
I know that this is a really sensitive topic. We're going to have a lot of different viewpoints here, and I think that's okay. So I appreciate that your perspective of this is that it is adhering to cultural norms. And I think in some ways, there are aspects of it that would be adhering to cultural norms, right? So let's go with the sweatpants option, right? A cultural norm of an interview process is the idea that you kind of dress up, right? Even if the job is maybe something a little bit more casual, you dress up for the interview. So maybe I can sit at work in jeans, but I probably would never go to an actual interview in jeans. I would wear a suit, or I would wear a skirt, or I would wear something that reflected that cultural standard. So I think that would be an example of adhering to cultural norms. But when we talk about something like hair, Black hair textures can be clean, tidy, organized, but won't resemble white hair textures whatsoever. So I can put the effort into my hair and it still won't look the way the cultural white norms of America expect it to look. And that's where you get the problem, right? I have to literally heat up metal plates and then drag them through my hair in order to achieve this kind of texture. Now, not all hair can do that. And that's the other part of this, is that some people are unable to actually achieve that assimilation because the standard is not based around a cultural norm. It's based around racial expectations of hairstyle, and it's based around subjective valuation, right? There's not any kind of religious or needful reason why curly or kinky hair is considered untidy. There's just not. There's no reason why curly hair is considered potentially dirtier or makes you get taken less seriously. All of those things are incredibly arbitrary. So some of the comparisons that you're drawing between cultural norms and assimilation, I think are a little bit off base, unfortunately. I think you have to look at the wider aspects and separate out what is arising out of a cultural norm that most people can achieve because it's a cultural norm, and what's arising out of potentially racial discrimination, unfamiliarity with a culture, ignorance of cultural standards, stuff like that. So I do want to move on, but thank you for that. I do appreciate your perspective. I think it's a good one. And I think it's one that we should talk about because there are different expectations in different countries. I think it's worth highlighting that sometimes it can be confusing to identify what's a cultural norm that you might want to have in your behavior in order to fit in better, and what is assimilation being done on the part of a minority group to avoid being ostracized for who they are. But thank you. Okay. I'm happy to follow up afterwards if you want to shoot me an email, or if we've got time later tonight. I'm good with that. We can even have a longer discussion about this. I'm very open to it. So I'm going to move on. So in the group / your opinion, can cultural appropriation occur for historical groups that may not have contemporary groups that strongly identify with that historical group, but that there were historical power dynamics at play / oppression of that group at that time in history? So generally speaking, cultures may shift and change, and different groups exist at different points in time. You will find descendants of these people, even if their culture doesn't necessarily look like it did then. So I think going to those descendants of those groups, even if it has changed largely, and looking at how they have historically conceptualized their culture is probably the best way to avoid misstepping when trying to work with those cultures. If you are looking at a truly completely extinct culture, you may find it much more challenging to do the kind of research that it would take. And no, there may not be people running around who are going to be calling you on any missteps that you make. But I would still recommend doing as faithful a reproduction of that culture as possible with the research that you are able to get, and making sure that you are being as faithful in your representation as you can be to avoid perpetuating false stereotypes. Because if you are the only person portraying this culture or researching this culture, or giving information on this culture that someone has ever met, and you are misrepresenting something even out of ignorance, that's what they're going to take away. That's what they're going to know. So I think it it can be complicated to do that. So seeking out modern day descendants as best you can, and then really doing the due diligence with what research is available is probably the best way to go. Okay. So Ulrich, did I just chat with you? Ulrich von Rothenberg, did we just chat about the?
Yeah, but the other thing I wanted to, I had a different point earlier, but I just want to thank you for your viewpoint and everything. The only thing I would sit there and say different, if you were in Asian countries and stuff, I would disagree with you about the hair and stuff, because there is a viewpoint, but that's, like I said, we can have that discussion somewhere else.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know if you cut off. Yes, so I agree with you completely in that as you move around the world, these power structures will change, right? It can be very complex. So as you move around and we look at the power dynamics, I'm speaking about my hair in the context of someone who really has only interviewed for jobs here in the US and in specific regions of the US at that. I would say, yeah, that's totally valid. It would be very different in other places. And the standards would be different and the expectations would be different. And the ways in which potential discrimination versus assimilation versus cultural norms would manifest very differently. So yes, thank you for that point. That's a good one.
Well, I mean, what I wanted to bring up, I want to thank you, but what I wanted to bring up, and this probably will infuriate a lot of people also, I don't see cultural appropriation as a problem. I see it.
I think you cut out.
Okay, this is Gigi.
It keeps cutting me off, but what I was saying, I see cultural appropriation as a positive, not a negative. So if any of you were, children of the 80s like us, I faced off against the Soviet Union and stuff. And it wasn't until we started integrating with them, they started having, and we started having exchanges, and they started, having Coca-Cola. They loved Harley Davidsons. McDonald's started going over there. We started seeing each other as people. We started appreciating each other's culture, and then the animosity started going away, and it starts breaking down. In Germany, when I'm German, my mother's German, I'm first generation American. When I was there in 95 to 98, they have Fasching, which is kind of like our Mardi Gras and Carnival. So they're really interested in Halloween. So they would come onto the bases, participate and everything else. When I was just there from 2011 to 2015, I spent 4.5 years there, they've appropriated it. It is now part of their culture and stuff. And I think it's great, and it brings the Americans and the Germans closer. And when you go to Darmstadt, where you go to the top of the castle, you have the Frankenstein castle, which they turn into a haunted house and everything else. So appropriation to me is different cultures and ethnicities where you celebrate the other person's differences. And I mean, good grief.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Jessica is explaining a little bit different meaning of appropriation and not appreciation. She will actually get to the appreciation part in this talk. And I think in some of those things, she'll actually agree with what you're saying. But we don't want to skip the other people who have been waiting in the queue. And so I'm going to let the floor go back to Jessica now.
Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off. I know we've got a lot of people in here. I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to chat. I think I understand what you're saying. And I think what I would contextualize that is much more appreciation or exchange. Like we kind of laid out at the beginning, appropriation does have some element of harming that secondary culture for profit or to the detriment of the second culture. And the things that you're talking about are extremely positive. So I definitely think that they would be better categorized as appreciation or exchange. Someone mentioned diffusion, which is another good term. Sharing of cultures is definitely something that I don't want to discourage. I want to make sure that people understand the difference between what is considered appropriation and problematic and what isn't. And like I said at the very beginning, appropriation is more than just taking on elements of a culture for your own, right? There's a lot more to it. But let's circle back to that. Let's keep going through the questions, and then we'll talk more about what appreciation can be. I want to move on. How do I approach someone who appears to be misappropriating another culture? So that is a very challenging topic. This class is supposed to be a tool for self-reflection and a way for us to evaluate the work that we do in our own personas, and not a way for us to kind of go out into the world and be like, hey, I took this class, I don't like what you're doing. If there is something that you recognize, particularly if you are part of the group that you see is being appropriated, if you're close to that person, gently taking them aside and saying, hey, I noticed you were interested in this. Let me give you more information about it. These are some of my favorite sources on the topic. Can be a very gentle way of kind of course correcting. Sometimes I'll see people really excited about one or two elements of a culture. So that's what they latch on to. But I know that they're missing other elements that would make their representation more complete. So what I'll say is, it looks like you're really interested in this particular thing. I happen to know someone who also does this thing. Can I put you in touch with them? I think you guys can bounce ideas off of each other. I think there's a lot that this person could teach you, and there's a lot that you can teach them. Opening the discussion in ways that is not necessarily aggressive is usually best, only because a lot of appropriation has the potential to be coming out of ignorance, and immediately attacking people will put them on the defensive. Now, generally speaking, like I said, this toolkit is more for self-reflection. So my intent is that people are able to look at the personas that they are attempting to portray and then evaluate and go, okay, have I contextualized this correctly? Would it hold up to questions if I were asked them? Am I taking an honest representation? Have I avoided cherry picking? What are the potential pitfalls with this in terms of religious symbol or culturally relevant touchstone, etc.? So that would be if you must engage gently. But mostly I would say, look at yourself first and make sure that the work that you're doing is modeling the behavior for other people that you want to see. Okay, next question. I am a costumer and pattern maker, and I love to make all periods and cultures. Does this mean I cannot wear what I make? If I can, how do I make it right? So I haven't said this particular phrase yet, but I do want to say it. I am not the arbiter of appropriation, right? I am teaching a class and I am sharing my perspectives and my research and the understanding that I have gleaned in my studies. But I am not the final say on what is or is not appropriation, and I can't tell you if the actions that you're taking are or are not. So that's just a blanket kind of reminder for all people. Like I said, it is not always clear. It is sometimes a very complicated topic. To this question specifically, I would say robust research and coming from a respect for the culture at hand is probably the best way to ensure that you're not misstepping in any of your reproductions. Certainly, I think that you can wear them, and consulting with the groups involved, if at all possible, it's the best way to make sure that your representation is very positive. I really recommend primary sources. As things kind of get translated through secondary sources and potentially tertiary sources, and you read a critique of someone's book on this topic that they wrote based off of a paper, you lose something because each person put something of themselves into it. If you go back to the primary sources in a culture, you are able to get a more honest representation of what they want to represent. And I often encourage people to think about giving that culture a platform. So if you are a fashion designer and you want to do a series on Peruvian ponchos or something like that, working with a fashion designer from Peru and helping to elevate the work that they put into a line of ponchos would be a better option, because you are giving them a platform and you're using your position to help elevate and bring visibility to them while still engaging in the kind of research and study that you're interested in. So that would be a really good example of ways to kind of reach across and bring things to a place of exchange and appreciation. So effectively research and collaboration. You've mentioned giving credit several times. How do you give credit? How does anyone know that you've given credit? So it depends on your forum, right? It depends on your material. If I'm just kind of wearing something on the street, I'm obviously not going to have like a little like museum placard here that's like, I got this from here. Instead, looking at the different ways. So if you're an academic, you cite your sources. You cite all of your sources, even sources that people may not have been able to trace from you because you got it from this translation of this wild thing. Cite your sources, cite your inspiration so that there is an intrinsic link between the work you do and the work people have done before you. Another way, let's say if this was, well, like I said, the fashion designer, working with someone, being able to showcase someone else. If I were that fashion designer, I might explicitly call out the work that I had done with them on a website or in a book or in an interview about my line. I would specifically say, this is derived from this person, this place. Being certain to give as much information and detail as I could, because I could say, yeah, okay, this is just designed, it's Peruvian inspired. But if I am more specific, and if I do say, this comes from this specific area, the people there hand weave this out of this particular thing, I'm giving other people the gift of sharing that knowledge that they may not have had. And I'm not taking credit for some aspect of the work that I didn't do, and I'm not claiming it for my own. So I think that would be probably some examples of giving credit. If you want to drop different ways in which you're curious about how that manifests better, I can speak to that a little bit more.
Jess, just for a second, we have two people with their hands up, and I know it's kind of hard for you to go from
I'm sorry.
the questions we're feeding you to that. Do you want Gadai and Mirabai and Darius just to write their questions in the chat box, or do you want to take them for a second?
No, I'll go ahead and take them. I'm just going down the list. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So okay.
So okay, Gadai, why don't you go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Okay, thank you. I'm Master Gadai Katsunaga from Atlantia. And my question is, you're talking about cherry picking, and I do a Japanese persona, obviously, and I'm not Japanese. And I do a samurai. So I am, in a way, cherry picking their culture because I'm trying to do what society says and pull the very best out of their culture to be the honorable samurai. And the SCA tells us to cherry pick because they want all the best from the Middle Ages, not the worst from the Middle Ages. So how do you rectify this while still trying to avoid appropriating the culture? And that's, you know, I've researched everything I do as much as I can. That's why I have a laurel. But it's still a question that comes into my mind, and I'm actually moving personas away from Japanese because I had somebody in the SCA say, well, you're kind of appropriating the Japanese culture. And I had somebody outside the SCA ask me the same question. And I'm wondering, you know, how do you move along this path? Because I see a very fine line between appreciation and appropriation. And sure. That's my question is where do you look at that? I mean, I'm not profiting from it. So from your earlier definition, I'm not, you know, appropriating it. I'm not profiting from it at all. I'm doing a lot of research. I'm trying to cite my sources. I'm trying to give people more to learn from, but I am cherry picking because there's a lot of things about the time period I'm doing in Japan that were very brutal, and we don't want to display that. Mm-hmm. So that's my question. If you can give us a roundabout way to try to look for this to avoid that pitfall.
Sure. So in my opinion, I think there's a chasm between portrayal and manifestation and research, right? So when I think of the word cherry picking, and I should define that better because I think I'm using it in a way that is not as clear as it could be. So when I think about cherry picking, I think about a couple aspects of a culture that I find cool, right? And then jumping into a persona without doing the further research it would need to be a robust interpretation. So I think it's that difference between putting in the research to become proficient in knowledge of a culture versus just your basic kind of fan level of engagement, and representing that as expert knowledge. So in your case, I would say it is perfectly, it sounds like you've done all the research, you know what the problematic aspects would be. So if I came up to you and I said like, oh my God, this is super cool, like this sounds like this utopic thing, you'd be like, actually, here are some aspects of it that we wouldn't recreate within the SCA, but this is how it manifested. I'm sure if you had to do a research paper, you would be able to explain the differences between how you have constructed the best parts for your persona versus what your persona would have actually looked like and what problems would have gone into it. So this is across a lot of personas, right? We want to be faithful, but we don't want to recreate the parts that are bad. There's a lot of problematic things. Like, I don't want people recreating misogyny in the name of avoiding appropriation. But to pretend like it didn't exist or to not do the research to know that these problems existed is definitely to misrepresent the culture, because the people who lived in that culture did deal with these problems. I don't see it as much different than me kind of even just baking like a loaf of bread and being like, so this would have been done in a stone oven that was dug into the side of a cliff, but I don't have a cliff, so I baked this in my electric oven. I know the ways in which I'm deviating. I know the ways in which the original was valuable to that original culture. I can talk about that. I will represent that in my research, but I might not manifest it. So I guess that's kind of what I consider the difference. Knowledgeable choice not to represent negative aspects versus uninformed ignorance of aspects, which I would consider cherry picking. So that's my take. Again, just my personal take. I can't draw that line very clearly. It's definitely going to be to your level of comfort. And it sounds like these are conversations you're already kind of having with yourself already. Is all that clear? Does that perspective and does that clarification of the term cherry picking work?
He's nodding yes, so it looks like it is.
Okay, I can't see you, I'm sorry.
And so next we have Mirabai and Darius.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, for those who don't know me, I'm Maestra Mirabai. My question was, I've been a henna artist for 20 years now, and just in the last 6 months, I've had more than a few people say, like, don't you feel like that's cultural appropriation for you as a white person to be doing henna, since that's not indigenous to white culture? And I was kind of caught off guard because, like I said, I've been doing it for 20 years and it's just come up in the last 6 months. And my answer that I gave was that I don't feel that it's cultural appropriation because I'm very happy to talk to anyone who I work on about the cultures that henna comes from and how it would have traditionally been made and used, etc. But I don't know if that's the best answer. And I've been questioning ever since if it actually is cultural appropriation and if I should not be using it. So I just wanted to know your take on it.
Okay, so quick reminder, I can't.
I know.
Yes.
Yeah, I know. You're not the end all be all of this, but just curious.
So henna does arise from a lot of different cultures, right? We find henna in different African cultures. Ethiopia has a strong tradition of henna. Southeast Asian cultures, there's a lot of different communities that engaged with usage of henna, and that manifested in different styles. So the more geometric patterns versus the more floral patterns versus, different spirals. This is not something that I am extremely familiar with. I can give you information for people who are more familiar with it, but to me, it becomes I measure things against the profit/detriment quotient, right? So am I misrepresenting this culture? Have I done my due diligence with the research? Or am I profiting off of this in a way that that culture could not? So I don't know what the henna community looks like. If the henna community is rife with people for whom their background does not include henna, and they are doing very, very well, where people whose background does include henna are struggling to make footholds in this particular community, I would probably look at that and use that as my benchmark. Like I said, I don't know, so I can't speak to that. With
so my experience with the henna community is that it's a very mixed community. I mean, it's been great because I've gotten to meet Indian women, Pakistani women, and Moroccan women, and Somali women, and talk with them about their cultural backgrounds. And it doesn't seem like one group of people is profiting off the other or profiting more than the other. But I just felt like, coming completely from a non-henna background in my culture, is it still appropriate for me to be doing it all, even if I'm educating people about those cultures?
I think if you're educating people faithfully, it's probably fine. But the best people to ask are these people that you're working with, because they would be. And
they don't. When I asked them, they were like, "No, it's cool." So I just
good. People from that culture, especially people practicing the same art, are the best people to tell you where the line should be.
Okay.
So I think that's probably a safe place to set yourself. Going back to that primary group.
Thank you.
Okay, so who do I have next, Gigi? I'm sorry.
Okay, we have Latoya with her hand up.
Okay. Go ahead and unmute.
And I think that's the only hand I see.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I posted this in the chat, and I've regularly talked about this. From what I've heard, the issue is that a lot of people are feeling cultural intimidation instead of that sense of understanding cultural appreciation. And most of it is it's coming out of the current element right now. So you have a very, charged environment outside in a mundane world, if you will, where people are, trying to pay homage to such movements as Black Lives Matter, and people who have been doing their best within the game to make sure that they are not misappropriating culture are now starting to be attacked for trying to appreciate culture, or they're wanting to ask the questions and they're being shut down for asking the questions. And so now it's starting to create an environment of cultural intimidation. And again, I've often talked about this on my own personal Facebook page, and I'm very open about that. And I know there are people feeling that right now. So how would you address these issues, or give some advice to people who are doing these attacks? What could be done to quiet some of these attacks, knowing that we do have genuine people out here who want to appreciate cultures?
Yeah, I can see that reflection. I think part of it arises from a larger misunderstanding of what appropriation is. So at the top, when I kind of talked about how a lot of people are under the impression that appropriation is any taking of an element of another culture for your own, without any nuance, that has become the wider cultural narrative, at least the one that I'm seeing, and it's inaccurate, right? It's a broadening of the term that was never intended to be interpreted that way. The term was created to talk about the problems that marginalized groups faced when they couldn't claim aspects of their culture that other people were profiting from. And so the fact that we've broadened it has led to a lot of accusations that I think are coming from ill-informed places a lot of the time. The SCA is also such a unique space. What we do is outside of the scope of what many people really have a feel for, really understand. So I have gotten a lot of questions, not about appropriation, but kind of the general gist of everything that I do in the SCA. And I've had to explain a lot. I've had to explain a lot of our structure, a lot of the choices that we make, a lot of our scholarship. So I think being prepared with basically your elevator pitch of, so here's the context in which I do this. And also here's the research for which I've done this. I also have a bunch of sources on the handout that talk more about cultural appropriation and its actual intended meaning. And so letting people know that they're generalizing the term a little bit and that they are confusing appreciation with something else can help. If you are a person who's feeling culturally intimidated, right? If you are getting a lot of negative feedback for something, definitely take a look at what you're doing. Make sure you are getting your research from credible places, double check the things you're saying, double check your sources, but then present that research. And basically you can use that as your platform of, so this is what I've studied. These are the areas in which I have found validation for doing this portrayal. You won't always find that as a note. There are some cultures, particularly some indigenous cultures, that I would not recommend taking on persona-based representations. But if you are interested in research or learning more about them, many of them have outreach groups. You can do ANS projects based on the information you get from them. You can bring in speakers or performers from that culture. There's a lot of ways to engage with the culture that aren't necessarily taking a persona and putting it on yourself. But if you are in a place where you have done the due diligence, you feel comfortable backing up whatever you've got in terms of research, I would say basically stepping forward and contextualizing everything for people is probably a good start. People are often acting out of misinformation and not malice.
Okay, so we're going to switch back to your list again,
Okay.
just to give those questions some air, and then I'll let you know when more hands are raised that are kind of getting in the queue on this side.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, can you discuss how problematic examples of cultural appropriation specifically impacts SCA persona expression and research in a negative way? So I talked a little bit earlier about things I had heard regarding blackface and yellowface. Not good. I think when you say problematic examples of cultural appropriation, I'm going to assume how that may skew my research. So if people are not using those primary sources, if people are basically, if I Google something and I start pulling sources from pages that aren't necessarily accredited, from people who are themselves not experts on the culture that they are trying to give me information about, that would be a way in which their appropriation has skewed my research and my representation. It's always good to go back through and validate the scholarship that you're engaging in, right? Check to see what sources your source used. Wikipedia is a perfectly fine place to look for information. And if you look at the bottom, you will see all of those places they gathered that summary from. Go to those places. See where they are, see the validity of them, see how closely they connect to that primary source that you're looking for, and see what information they chose to include and what they chose not to include. Because sometimes if you are researching something and you don't engage with the information that the author didn't think was important, you'll miss something that you will find important. So I would say kind of backtracking through your research, making sure that other people's missteps won't influence yours as it filters down. That would probably be my answer if I'm interpreting your question correctly. I think I touched on the credit question. And then the next one, raised hand. Okay. Do you want to go ahead and ask, or do you want me to read off what I have here in chat, Aline?
Oops, sorry, I hit the wrong button. Okay, no, I kind of wanted to explain because I've been kind of listening to everybody else's answers and it's kind of changed mine a little bit, my question. So I was thinking of it more in terms of like, I love that we changed the mission to be just pre-17th century, right? And I think that's a great thing and that we should encourage that. But I worry that, because I understand that, sorry, I've like totally bleh. So like, I understand that like people of color, they may come and they may see what we're doing and they may want to be an English Lord, and that's totally fine. But I know a really great aspect of how we operate as a community in the SCA is we have newcomers and they're like, I don't really know what I want, but I see what you're doing. And then there's like, oh, let me show you how I do this. And, you have somebody else come in and say, I'm kind of interested in France. And they're like, oh, well, then I'm going to send you to this person and we're going to get you all hooked up. We don't have, if you are a person of color and you're like, well, I want to know more about like African cultures or Asian cultures or something, you might not have anybody in your local area, or maybe only like one person in your whole kingdom who does that. And so I was thinking like, would it be useful to branch out in my own art research? I mean, I'm mostly a manuscript research, but would it be useful to like branch out into other cultures that I don't normally go around in to be like, hey guys, let's do a class now. Let's see about this culture's manuscript art or this culture's manuscript art. And just even having, but I do wonder about like, would that be inviting to newcomers who maybe want to see more representation, or would it be like, oh, just white people talking about being Japanese or white people talking about being African or whatever? What do they know? Like, I don't want to repulse people when I'm actually trying to like be more inclusive. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
So I would absolutely encourage you to present research, present those sources to other people. I attended a meeting in like a baronial meeting where we talked about the potential of looking at presenting museum artifacts from different places as a way of introducing new areas of A&S study and research geographically. And so I super encourage that. I think that is fantastic. Being able to present other people's work as, hey, these are these manuscripts that I have found. Look at these illuminations. I've even tried my hand at a reproduction. This is something that you can explore as well. That, I think, is the heart of the SCA. I think that's a great idea. And especially a well-researched attempt. Something that I recommended is there's currently, Northwestern has an exhibit for Caravans of Gold, which is a bunch of African artifacts in our period from the Horn of Africa. And it's amazing. It's amazing. I made it to the exhibit when it was in person. And then COVID hit and they created an app and anyone can download it. And it's a way to access this research that many people are not going to have exposure to outside of it because there's not many exhibits like it. That is definitely something that I've encouraged people when they've asked, hey, how do I show the SCA that there's this opportunity for persona diversity? There's this opportunity for study across all of these new places. And that's something that I've explicitly been like, there's this app. It's amazing. So yeah, Caravans of Gold, super cool. The kind of thing you're talking about, I think, is a great idea. I think you can avoid any appropriative anything by making sure that your research is really robust and you're citing those sources and giving due credit to the original culture and the original artists. But it sounds like you would do that. So this is great. I think it's wonderful.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. What about accents? My SO uses a Russian accent at times. He has performed this for naturalized citizens of Russian origin who have told him it is actually a pretty good one. This is where my question stems from regarding accents and seems to be appreciation. Could you see it being misinterpreted as appropriation? Simple answer, yes. Accents can be tricky. I cannot speak to how good most people's accents are or are not, being a native English speaker, and not having a lot of experience with other people's accents outside of it. But I think I would discourage people from taking on accents from languages they don't speak on a personal level. Again, I am not the arbiter of appropriation. If this is something that your husband feels comfortable doing and that native speakers have given the stamp of approval, there's probably spaces in which no one would challenge this. I personally probably wouldn't recommend it. I think it can be very rife, potentially. And there's a lot to consider with accents, right? Regionality and dialect and language choices. Yeah, I think that's a complicated one. For the sake of safety, I would probably lean towards no, but that's just my personal. Okay. My cousin in India is asking, is skin bleaching that is sadly so prevalent in their culture right now and quite damaging health-wise too, an example of cultural assimilation to the world? Yes. Yes, it is. So there is a larger hierarchy globally, particularly among countries that have experienced colonialism, where there is a hierarchy of whiteness. So you will find skin bleaching across many countries. It is usually performed to achieve better proximity to said whiteness. It is very frequently arising out of something very problematic. And commonly those countries will have hierarchies of skin tones. Colorism is a term that's used in many communities to describe the difficulties experienced by more darker skinned individuals who are usually farther from that proximity of whiteness that we're talking about. Skin bleaching is just one of those really damaging ways people try to achieve proximity to whiteness in a way that quite literally can be physically very, very harmful, right? Because skin bleaching is achieved using different types of acids and things that, quite frankly, should not be on your skin. So, yes, sadly. What constitutes as appropriation as opposed to being inspired and working towards an authentic representation of a culture? So I'm actually going to go ahead and refer you back to what we talked about earlier in the original definition, where we talked about the ideas of working on something to the detriment or at the profit of a culture, making it more appropriative, and making sure that you're connecting back to the culture, citing your sources, and giving them a platform to be visible as appreciative. So that's not hard and fast. It depends greatly on the culture that you're trying to engage with, but that would be kind of a general baseline that I would start with. And then if I wanted to tease it out more, I'd probably talk more about the specifics that were mentioned earlier. Okay. Recognizing that a lot of appropriation comes from ignorance, it's often incumbent on the person whose culture is being appropriated to say something. This is problematic. What advice do you have to reapproach someone who refuses to listen or change or learn? So that is very difficult. It can be almost impossible, especially within the framework of just trying to interact with people in the world. We see appropriation a lot and it goes unchecked. What I'd like to do is create a culture of education around the topic, particularly within the SCA, such that everyone understands the kind of work that they should be doing in portraying their own personas, and so is not unintentionally engaging in this. And then if you've got people who you've approached and you've talked to, and they're still refusing to work on things, I would say talking to the power structures that we have in place in the SCA, and seeing if they would be willing to lend their voices to it, going to your seneschal or going to your baronial chair or regional seneschal or whoever it might be, and saying, you know, hey, there's this thing, it's happening. I think it's harmful. I think it could be hurting people. I think it could be damaging the image that we put out into the world. Can we talk about that behavior? And really focusing on the behavior rather than kind of maligning the person, I think is a key part of getting people to understand in the right way. We don't want people to feel defensive, particularly if they're not operating out of malice, which people generally don't. They usually operate negatively, I should say, out of ignorance. It's just true. Making clear that it's not that we think they are a problematic person. It's that this specific behavior that they are engaging in is problematic, and here's how they can better change it. I think that's a really good foundation for conversation. And I think that's a good foundation for conversation overall. I'm a very big fan of focusing not on assumptions about a person's character, but rather focusing on the kind of behavior that may be violating our core values or maybe causing harm to other people in the SCA emotionally. I think that's a good starting point. So that would be my recommendation for that. Okay. Are there guidelines on behavior in personas as presented at SCA events? For example, some people might find it offensive when a person portrays a Muslim and is seen eating pork and drinking alcohol. So there are not guidelines currently. We demand an attempt, right? That's all the SCA asks for. So there are not guidelines to this. I would say for people that want to portray personas, they should be prepared to potentially answer questions about that. People might ask, right? You may get questioned on that. And those questions may be coming out of a place of hurt or offense or just seeking understanding. So being prepared to talk about the choices that you've made with your persona, being able to back up the choices you've made with research, with conversations that you've had with other people. I think all of those are really valuable ways to not only making sure that you're not misstepping, but also kind of nipping any problematic things in the bud. Because if you've done the foundational research and you know that you're deviating from your persona in some significant way, you'll be better prepared to address that if/when it comes up. But there are not currently guidelines for how people manifest their personas. Many people, in fact, are not super interested in the research and academics that goes with things. They just, they thought this thing was pretty and they just want to put it on and show up. And that is also why approaching these conversations with delicacy can be challenging but important, to not putting people on the defensive. Okay. It used to be that we would encourage newbies that their persona could be anything. With the new aspect of cultural appropriation going on, is it still? Oh, I'm sorry. I think there was a typo, but that's okay. Still a go to encourage a white or Hispanic newbie to pursue, let's say, an Asian persona. So that's fine. When we talk about cultural appropriation, what we're trying to do is not stop people from pursuing other personas than their own, but rather encourage people to pursue them in a way that is respectful, in a way that gives a platform to those particular cultures, in a way that's informative. So we don't want to encourage people from pursuing any other persona. That's not what this is about. And I do hope that everyone is very clear that there are ways to pursue cultural knowledge within the framework of the SCA that are not appropriative. We really want to just avoid that negative behavior. So having people pursue these within the context of, good academic scholarship and citing primary sources and engaging faithfully and respectfully, I think that's how I would encourage people to go about it. I would give them the tools that we've talked about in this class and have themselves go from there. Okay. Would wearing comical clothing at an event be considered cultural appropriation? So that's kind of broad. Again, I'm not no arbiter, so I can't give you the smackdown on this is definitely cultural appropriation and this definitely isn't, because no one person can do that, and if they exist, they're not me. I think when you say comical clothing, it has the potential to lean into something that could be mocking the culture. And I would say mocking the culture would be problematic. So when we talk about that, definitely being careful about how that manifests would be important, what that looks like. It would depend on the clothing itself, though, I think. Okay. And then I've got, could you talk about the aspect of robust research? All the framing seems to be from the academic perspective. I am just starting to navigate research, but the framework of my thoughts comes from the fighter culture. I am pursuing new research for what I want to know about, but I am starting from a point of ignorance. I can do a Google search, but what can I do as a non-academic to improve my understanding? So my instinct is to just say, go to the Laurels, because the Laurels, quite frankly, are the best resource that I can point to in the SCA and say, these people will help you not only with possibly specific research to what you want, but also with the tools to do better research yourself. So I know that there are Laurels and apprentices in my kingdom that have classes that talk about how to do better research. I know that we have people that are librarians in the SCA. I know that we have Laurels that cover a vast swath of materials and backgrounds and arts and sciences, and just, it's incredible. And so going to the Laurels as a group, you can find, I think there's an Ask the Laurels Facebook group, but you can also go to some of your local people and say, hey, I'm really interested in this. Can you possibly use your network to help connect me to people? And I think many of them will be very excited to do that for you. So yes, go to the Laurels. They will help you find information. There are a lot of librarians in the SCA. They will help you find information, or they will help you learn how to find that information more effectively. I always ask other folks. There's also a lot of different groups online. There's different Facebook groups. So there's an SCA Africa, there's an SCA Korea, there's a ton, right? I couldn't go through them all right now. So those are also good jumping off places if you're like, oh, I don't even know where to start. That's a good place to start. So Ask the Laurels and then check out SCA specific Facebook groups would be my two starting points. And then yeah, go from there. Okay. So we want to encourage people to play personas they want, but we want them to focus on the positives of that persona. So not necessarily, but the greater scope of the SCA is kind of history as it should have been. So what we don't want to necessarily bring into our behavior in the SCA are all of those very negative behaviors that we might have seen manifest throughout history, right? I mentioned misogyny earlier because that's kind of a gimme in a lot of cultures for a very long time. You don't want that here. We categorically do not want to bring that into our society. It will be part of robust research to recognize that this existed so that you can then disrupt that negativity in an informed way. So I don't want people to necessarily only play positives of their persona, but I do want them to not let their persona influence bad behavior within the SCA. Because quite frankly, if you try to use your persona as justification for why you're being a jerk, it's not going to go well. You will still be called on it. As much as it's great that people get into their personas. You're still accountable for your behavior and words. And the things that you say will not be excused just because, well, in period, I would have been like, nope, not good. So that's maybe a better clarification on that. Okay. Is there a way the upper power structure of the SCA, peers and royals / the most visible, can better represent cultural appreciation versus taking part in appropriation beyond your sources, since that has been covered? Okay, so I think being more visible, making sure to elevate those sources verbally whenever possible is a really good way to do that. So if you're talking to someone and they admire your garb or what have you, being able to say like, oh yes, this is from this particular thing, this particular culture. I also think there's a higher responsibility on people that are more visible. Royals are generally the most photographed people in a kingdom at any given point. So if a royal were to wear something that was incorrect, a misrepresentation, or just kind of generally problematic, that image would be shared much further than those voices could go. And you would never be able to control that image well enough to give it context. So if you are engaging as a more visible person in a more problematic representation, people will see it and you won't be there to say, I know that this isn't the best, but what I was thinking was, so I think making sure you're holding yourself to that higher standard and then making sure that you're explicitly kind of participating in the forums that would give you the opportunity to talk about cultures from a place of knowledge. So different ANS things, even shout outs in court. I've heard people talk about the garb that they've got on in court. I've heard them talk about the different things they're doing. We had a reign in the kingdom recently where the king had an African persona that was in Japan. And so many Japanese customs were highlighted throughout the reign. And so what he did with that and what his staff and everyone associated did with it is basically put together a series of classes, salons, they brought in performers for the culture, and all of these things were based in giving people examples of this culture that were from experts that had done their research and done their due diligence. And so it was really a way for everyone to kind of participate in this greater vehicle for cultural appreciation because he had the platform to bring it to them. So that would be my personal take on that. Okay. And then Bear Killer's here. Hi, Bear Killer. And I want to highlight that he said he's currently the president, so you should definitely listen to him. If you don't listen to me, I suggest never use your persona as a reason to do ugly, insulting, or destructive behavior. Yes. Don't do that. It will not hold up. Just be aware of the expectations on your behavior. Be aware of the core values. Do not use your persona to justify problems. And do not use your persona to bring in negativity to the SCA. Oh, thanks. Okay, so I have no more questions on my list. I don't think anyone is poking me to show me more questions. I don't see any hands up. So does anyone else have anything else that they'd like to discuss on this topic, on anything else that is really quick, because I am going to leave in like 15 minutes. Okay, I did see something pop up in chat, so yeah.
There is one more question.
Sure.
From Facebook.
Okay. Okay, then I have two, because I see one more in chat. So I will do Facebook and then I will do the chat. Apologies if this has been covered already, but can you talk about popular perception / caricature versus accurate representation? Okay. I'm trying to think about the best ways to do this. I think this is probably a combination of like the cherry picking thing that we talked about earlier. So when we talk about popular perception, I gave the examples of like Pocahontas, Memoirs of a Geisha, things that are in pop culture, things that are pervasive. Disney movies are a really good place to go with this because until very recently, there was not a lot of due diligence done to accuracy, and it was mostly about what would play well with their audience. So I think looking at any variety of that kind of pop culture thing versus more accurate representation, I need to think a little bit about this question, and I don't know that I'll be able to come up with examples off the top of my head, but I have definitely heard of people talking about things like the recent Mulan live action, where I have seen critiques. I've not seen the movie and I'm not going to speak to it. I have seen critiques where people are displeased at the way elements of their culture had been manifest in the movie, that it felt like very cursory research had been done, but that elements were being misrepresented in the way that they were shown in the movie. Whereas generally speaking, if you look at A Woman Warrior, which is a book based on the historical figure of Mulan, it holds more true to the story, but that means that it's not that exciting in some parts. There are parts that are just, and then everyone found out that she was female and they went, yeah, okay, well, she's been here the whole time. Cool. That doesn't make for the same story, but that is an accurate representation of the historical figure. So that's kind of off the top of my head. I'm sure there's better examples. If anyone wants to drop them in chat or even speak up, I'm open to that. Okay. What advice would you give to someone that is feeling intimidated by robust research? For example, someone who is in the SCA primarily for social or martial activities and is not interested in doing in-depth research, but it now is feeling like they need to do a lot of in-depth study on their persona and garb to avoid being problematic. I would look at what you're portraying. If what you are doing is connected to a marginalized group, the standards will likely be higher. The repercussions for not doing the diligence for them could mean that you end up hurting people unintentionally. There are many cultures that are more commonly pursued that have a lot of research available. I mean, my first persona was Norse, and it took me no time to do the research for it because there is a lot available and it's very common right now in the SCA. So there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of people available to help with it. There's a lot of patterns. It doesn't require a ton of work to do a faithful representation. And then I moved into Ethiopian, and the research for my persona with Ethiopian has been challenging. Modern day texts are usually in Amharic or Hebrew. Period text would have been in Gez, which is basically dead, except for in religious communities and some communities in Ethiopia. I speak none of these languages. I am fortunate enough to be engaged to a wonderful man who does speak Hebrew and can theoretically help me in some areas, but it took so much more work to get the information that I needed to feel comfortable and to feel like if someone questioned me, I could back up the choices I've made. So look at the type of persona you're pursuing and possibly, go where you're more comfortable. And if you're not interested in doing, a lot of like deep research, I would say tend more towards the things that have a lot of readily available research. Okay, I don't have a persona, I have a wardrobe. This is the thing I say, and I heard it somewhere else, not sure where. I have garb from Italy, Germany, Norse, Norman, Persian. I try to make sure it is as period as possible, but not to the extent of being an expert on all of them. I have no real desire to do that much work. Do I need to change this? Not necessarily. I would say making sure that that garb that you have is a faithful and accurate portrayal of the cultures that you're representing is the most important thing, right? So if someone ran into you who is Persian and they looked at your garb, would they feel uncomfortable? If they asked you questions about it, would you be able to back up the choices made in your garb? Or could you point to the thing and say, you know, I don't know for sure, I got it from this place, but the pattern they used is right here, and here's the literature behind it. That would be what I would point to. Mostly I tell people, you know, because we require an attempt, I mean, there is nothing that says you need to do this research, but you may get questions and you should be prepared to answer those questions if they come in. And that's mostly what I remind people. I want to prepare people for the conversations that they may end up having with cultural appropriation being more in our narrative right now. Okay. Are there any specific cultures that you can think of offhand that are off limits for persona for a white person? There are many indigenous groups and Native American groups that have said, no, please do not take elements of our culture for our own. These are things that we can barely take on ourselves. We do not want you to do this. So I would highly advise respecting the wishes of these particular groups as you look into doing research. Like I mentioned really briefly earlier, a lot of these groups do educational outreach. You can bring in performers from these groups. You can work in tandem on an ANS project or do a research report on, you know, whatever the thing is about that culture that you find so interesting. There are so many ways to explore culture that don't involve taking a persona and putting it on your own body. I highly recommend interfacing with groups directly to find out where the level of comfort is, and then respect that, I would say. Again, I can't tell you what to do. This is my recommendation. This is not going to be put into policy. This is just me giving you my perspective on it. But I do highly recommend going to those primary groups to find out what the general opinion is from that group about what putting those elements on your own body might look like, because it does look different for many different groups. Did I do, I'm sorry, did I do that one? Okay. What advice would you give to someone that is feeling intimidated by robust research? For example, someone who is in the SCA primarily for social and martial activities and is not interested in doing in-depth research. I did this one, okay? Yeah, I did do this one. Thank you. Okay, sorry. That was our last one. It got highlighted twice. We're totally good. Does anyone have any follow-up questions? Does anyone have any other comments or anything that they want to throw out? Chat, raise hand, Zoom, anything?
Just want to say for those who have not downloaded the handout, there's a link to it in the chat box, and Jessica's contact information is on there in case you have a question you would like to email her.
Yeah. Evan? Thoughts? Questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
It might be complex. So I have a question with regards to being on the receiving end of someone accusing someone of a cultural appropriation because that person is passing.
Okay.
And how,
Someone
like, what's
receiving? Okay.
So, like, specifically for myself, I have Mongolian. My great grandmother was Mongolian, and I have Mongolian ancestry. And so, if I chose to portray a Mongolian persona, and because I pass as white, and was then, you know, someone came up to me and said, "Hey, you shouldn't do that. You know, what grounds do you have to do that persona, even though that is part of my family history and heritage?" So like, what's sort of your advice to deal with that situation, I guess?
I mean, I would probably be frank, but I tend to, again, I assume good intent. So if someone came up to me and did the same thing and I was in the same position as you, I would probably say something like, hey, I really appreciate that you are aware of the term and that you're looking out for this. In fact, here is my research. Here are the reasons for the choices that I've made. Some of this is coming from my own heritage. So this is something that I'm drawing on not only my research, but also my personal experience and my family's history. So here are the ways in which this is not appropriation. And then I would encourage them to maybe learn a little bit more about the term, because if they just come up and they're like, hey, you're a white guy doing this, it's appropriation, that is not a very deep read. And so it's probably not coming out of a place of high information. So I would probably gently encourage them to learn a little bit more about the term and what separates it and actually makes it problematic. That would be
use it as a teachable moment.
Everything's a teachable moment.
All right, thank you.
Of course. You can share the video. I mean, once the video's up, the video's up, and it'll be up on Facebook. So I am fine with this being shared, but I do want to kind of remind everyone, this is not policy, this is a class. These are my perspectives that I have gleaned through research. This is not going to give you hard and fast rules, but if the discussion is useful for unpacking your own kind of take on your personas, then yes, absolutely, please do share. All right, does anyone have anything else? Comments, final things, anything else? Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation. I thought it was really good. If you have any follow-ups, if you want to talk more about anything, please do email me at equity@sca.org. We also have the page, SCA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So you can follow that if you want to see more. We are going to be doing some kind of DEI class or roundtable every week. So right here, this time, Wednesday evenings, mostly. And I do teach outside of this too. You can just poke me and I'll come teach wherever you want. Thank you, pandemic. I can travel the world from the comfort of my couch. So thank you so much for coming. I hope everyone has a great night. And hopefully see you all next time. So good night, everyone. Oh, and thank you to my co-hosts. They're amazing. Thank you for doing all of this work and helping me not lose track of everything, because I would have been super overwhelmed. So thank you. Adore you guys.